With this week's Torah reading, Parshat VaYechi, we complete the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, and we say farewell to the patriarchs and matriarchs and the original 12 tribes of the Jewish people. And indeed, what we cover this week is the final 17 years of Jacob's life, where Jacob is living in the land of Egypt under the rulership of Pharaoh with his son Joseph as the viceroy of the land. And the Jewish people are living together in a place called Goshen, a specific area of Egypt, together in one place. In some ways, this sounds very peaceful, but what we know from the end of the previous Parsha is how trepidatious Jacob was, in leaving the land of Israel and going down to Egypt, understanding full well that this was the beginning of what was prophesied to Abraham from the get-go, that the Jewish people would find themselves strangers in a strange land. They would be enslaved there, they would suffer there, and they would emerge from there as the nation, as the Jewish nation, as the fulfillment of all of the prophecies and all the blessings and all the promises that were made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob throughout this book. In fact, when you look back at the previous Parsha, one of the great reassurances to Jacob was that when he passes away, Joseph's hands will be upon his eyes. Indeed, all 12 of his sons will be gathered around him. He'll pass away that way, but he will see the guardianship of Joseph over the Jewish people. And in a very inspiring way, the book of Genesis ends with Joseph before he dies, which is years later, reassuring the Jewish people that God will surely remember us and redeem us. And then Joseph, the first of the 12 brothers to pass away, passes away. It's noteworthy that Jacob is the only one between Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he's the only one who dies outside the land of Israel. And included in this week's Torah reading is the procession that brings him back to the land of Israel to be buried alongside Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and alongside his wife Leah, and not far from where his wife Rachel was buried on the roadside, on the road leading past Beit Lechem. Now, an interesting comment that Rabbi Sachs makes, and that is that none of the books of the Torah really conclude in a concluding way. We're ending off the story of the foundations of the Jewish people through the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the founding parents of the Jewish people, and we're leaving them in a precarious position, knowing full well that the darkness is about to envelop them. And indeed, as Rabbi Sachs points out, even the end of the Torah itself, when Moshe passes away and is succeeded by Yoshua, the goal of reaching the promised land is yet unreached and not fulfilled. And therefore, in a beautiful way, the Torah is really challenging us to see how we continue forward the events of the Torah, generation after generation, embodying them within our own lives, learning these lessons, and putting them into practice. What we're going to look at tonight is chapter 49. It begins on page 274 in the Stone Art Scroll Chumash. There are 50 chapters in the book of Genesis. This is the chapter that takes place just prior, or just as Jacob, the third and final patriarch of the Jewish people, is passing away. And let's take a look at what we read here, because I have an understanding now based on Rav Hirsch, which really differs and changes the way I've understood this until now. Chapter 49, sentence 1, Then Jacob called for his sons and said, Assemble yourselves, and I will tell you what will befall you in the end of days. gather yourselves and listen, O sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel your father, referring to himself by each of his names. And then he goes on and he talks to each of the 12 sons. And it's commonly understood that these are the blessings that he bestowed upon them. But the word blessings here has to be understood. But let's highlight something that Rav Hirsch really highlights first. The words Jacob uses, hey osvu, gather yourselves. And I'll tell you what's going to be at the end of days. He kabtsu, like the word kibbutz. Let's pull together and listen. And listen as the sons of Jacob and hear the words of Israel, your father. And what Hirsch makes of this is the following thing. What's primarily on Jacob's mind is the idea that here I'm about to leave the world, and I'm surrounded by 12 very distinct, very different individuals, each of whom is the root of a tribe of the Jewish people. And just to go back to something we discussed weeks ago, something that Rachel herself, the first chosen wife, who was meant to marry Jacob initially, but gave over that position to her sister Leah out of deference to her in order not to embarrass her. What we said the Maharal explains to us is that within her mind was it would be too perfect a scenario for Jacob in completing the three knotted chain of the patriarchs of the Jewish people to be married to one woman and have therefore all 12 sons born from one union between a father and mother. She understood that. God's plans for this world are more diverse, they're more troubling, they're less perfect and harmonious, just as we see the world, how the events of human beings unfold. But they have a plan and they have a meaning. And she accepted right away the notion that she would be one of the mothers, thinking that there would be one other mother, Leah, and it ends up being that there was Bilhah and Zilpah also. So four women share the distinction of being the mothers of the patriarchs of the founders of the 12 tribes of the Jewish people. They were not patriarchs, they were founding tribes. That alone is diversity. But then within each child, there's a mix of strengths and weaknesses and personalities. And achieving unity and harmony is not so simple. Now, the way this chapter 49 unfolds, Rashi takes an approach as follows. Jacob called them all together with the idea, I'm going to tell you the whole course of human history so that you could cling to a narrative, even as it unfolds over hundreds or thousands of years, whatever it'll end up being. But I'll tell you the whole arc of history. And then suddenly, that whole prophetic vision that he wanted to share with them disappeared from him. It was taken from him. And he realized God is withholding this information on purpose from the world. So he then switched and turned his attention to the individuals surrounding him. And by tradition, Rashi adds the Medrash that says his first thought was perhaps one of the 12 is not a believer, and therefore all 12 in harmony said, Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel, referring to Jacob himself, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, we're all believers. Whereupon Jacob responded, as we do when we say the Shema, Baruch, Shem, Kavod, Malchuto, Le'olam V'ed, blessed is God's kingdom and dominion forever and ever. But then he was still left in a lurch, and he wasn't able to continue with what he intended to do, and therefore he switches gears and instead gives a blessing to each one. And let's stop for a second. The idea of a blessing is not you should be great, you should be rich, you should win the lottery, you should live in a fantastic home, you should drive a great car. Those type of blessings, we don't call them blessings. Those are not the blessings that Isaac that contended for when his father died, those are not the blessings that Jacob and Esau contended over. Blessings here means an opportunity to understand yourself better, the ultimate blessing, so that you can see and grasp and fulfill your individual role amongst the other people around you. That's the ultimate blessing. Blessing achieves harmony, unity of purpose. That's the way I understood until now. What Hirsch adds here, and he reads into it, and may be different than Rashi, it may be harmonious with Rashi, I'm not sure, is that just as Jacob understood he was leaving the world, he looked around, he assessed the 12 individuals that he understood that were meant to be the foundational roots of the 12 tribes of the Jewish people that would ultimately prevail throughout the rest of history. He was perplexed by how different, he was perplexed by how seemingly non-harmonious a group this was. And therefore, Jacob rallies himself, and this is the way Hirsch reads it. And he says, Hey Osvu, let's assemble ourselves. Let's pull ourselves together. He kabtsu. Let's become a kibbutz. Let's become a working group here. And in order to do this, I'm going to tailor a blessing of insight so that each of you will understand yourselves better. And included in that is criticism. The first three sons, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, it's hard to see where there's a blessing here. Reuven, you were the firstborn, he starts off. And in a certain sense, Jacob's starting point is you should be the leader, Bechoriata. You're the Bechor. You have the rights of the firstborn. Kochi Varoshi Oni. You're Vareshi Oni. You have tremendous strength, tremendous power. And you really have within you the ability, the theoretical stature to be the leading Bechor, to be the truly firstborn. But you have abrogated that role because you showed yourself to be Hachaz Kamayim, impetuous, water-like, not stable enough, not reflective enough, not thoughtful enough, not insightful enough. And these are all different viewpoints done by different commentaries. And because you involved yourself in a couple of incidents, primarily the incident that when your mother passed away, you when Rebecca passed away, you very quickly interceded in trying to control my relationships with my remaining wives. That's impetuousness. You had good reason to do it. You could have come and talked to me. You could have presented yourself to me with a concern. I'm your father. I remain the leader of the family. You took matters into your own hands. You've disqualified yourself for leadership, albeit with great strength and great power around you and great leadership abilities. Some people say he's trying to define leadership abilities. I don't buy that. I think Jacob is simply saying, I don't want to leave a mess behind. I want to leave a game plan and an understanding that each of you can hold on to so that you can work to achieve harmony. And here's the kicker, because Hirsch says that ultimately is the only precursor to the end of days, to the resolution of all the elements of life coming together and coalescing in the way that God wants. And here Hirsch makes very strong comments, and we understand it today. We understand it in light of the fact that the Second Temple was destroyed 2,000 years ago because of baseless hatred. Baseless hatred, what does that mean? Our inability to accommodate one another, to appreciate one another, to see the good and the strength within others in spite of their differences, because of their differences, and to embrace them, and to have a real understanding that we function in a unified way as the Jewish people. That's what puts us in exile today. That's why we're also in a darker place than we're meant to be or than we could be. So that's what Jacob is taking on. Jacob is making it clear here forever. Listen, family, we're different. We have different proclivities, different strengths, different weaknesses. We have different ways of seeing the world. The challenge in front of us is to become one people, to harmonize as a group, not by giving up our individuality, but by learning to accommodate the strengths and weaknesses of one another in such a way that we can be a nation and function as a nation. And hence, I'll delineate roles for each of you. He continues on, Shimon and Levi. He praises them. He says, Achim, you have brotherhood. Now, what a wonderful thing to say about them. It's translated here as comrades, but the word Achim doesn't mean comrades. It means that you had tremendous feelings for the family. And he's referring back now to the time when Dinah was taken and when the two of them exacted revenge by wiping out the city of Shechem. What he's saying here is you have that special quality of deeply, deeply appreciating the need for unity and connection and brotherhood, and one person taking care of the other, and one person watching over for the other. But what you did is you overstepped the boundaries. Why? Because klei chamas michartehem. Your weaponry you, was a stolen craft. You resorted to violence and murder and killing out of love for our family, out of an interest in protecting the honor of your sister, out of sensitivity to the dignity and respect that the Jewish people deserve. All that's true. But when it says klei chamas, it means you stole this craft, and commentaries say you became like Esav, living by the sword. And that's not something that the Jewish people are meant to prevail using the sword. That's not our manner of achieving unity. That's not our manner of impacting the world. We're not going to be conquerors. That's other civilizations, other populations. Don't steal their craft. Don't become conspirators out of the goodness of your hearts, but rather understand that the rage that you showed, the intensity of that, the violence, that's not the way forward for the Jewish people. Because then he turns his attention to Yehuda. And if you think about it here, we're still looking for the firstborn, son number one, not qualified to act as the Bechor, to act as the firstborn. Son number two and number three, special qualities of love for their brothers, disqualified. Number four, we come to Judah. He is qualified. Why? He's like a lion cub. Hirsch, and a theme that Hirsch really enjoys and uses in several places, the word gur aryeh, which means a young lion and a mature lion. Hirsch always likes holding together the idea that you can have the idealism and the drive to make the world better of a young person, and it can be tempered with the maturity and reflectiveness and thought of an older person, and welding those two together, not becoming the older, complacent person who's riding things out on the status quo, but not to be the young, impetuous, raging, perhaps overly violent person who's out to just make things in the way that they want them to be, but an ability to harmonize those two things. Yehuda emerges. He becomes the king. And Jacob says, the scepter of royalty will never leave you, can never leave you. Okay, and with that will come his blessings. Now, interesting to note, though, so that takes care of the first four. I'm going to skip because I want to say something here. So Yehuda is named as the Bechor, as the royal leader of the Jewish people. And I just a word here about what it means. We talk about Malchut Shemayim, God's kingship. In Hebrew, there's a difference between being a Melech and being a Moshel, which the Torah uses in other places. A Moshel is someone who rules through authority and by dint of their strength. Even God does not seek to rule the world that way. God wants to be a melech. Therefore, what do we say? Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. We accept the Malchut Shemayim. We accept willingly and as free individuals God's kingship over us. We do it specifically on Rosh Hashanah. We do it twice a day in the morning and the evening by saying the Shema. We recognize the fact that God is not ruling over us, so to speak, but we are placing upon ourselves God's dominion over us willingly in recognition of the fact that this is God, out of gratefulness, out of humility, out of a sense that God is our creator. God provides all life for us. So therefore, that role falls into the hands of Yehuda. Now, what you'll also find discussed widely in this week's Torah reading is, but what about Yosef? Because when you turn to Yosef, and his blessing begins on page 280, sentence 22 here. The blessing for Yosef is very verbose. It's much bigger than the other blessings. It's much more poetic. It's much more encompassing. So, question. What does it mean that Yehuda should be the king and yet Yosef should be the recipient of the most enveloping, poetic, encompassing blessing of all? And by the way, this is paralleled again at the end of the Torah in the blessings that Moshe gives to each of the 12 tribes. So for this, there's a beautiful idea that I want to quote. There's an association with the blessings given to Joseph with Proverbs chapter 22, sentence 9. Yosef was the beneficiary of more blessings than any of his brothers. And again, the blessings aren't you should get. That's not the idea of a blessing. The blessing is look at the dimensions of greatness that you hold. So what does it say in Proverbs chapter 22, sentence 9? It says, Tov ayin bo yivorach. Someone with a generous eye, that's where blessing should reside. Why? And it continues, Ki nosan min lachmo nadal. Because a person with a good eye automatically takes his bread and shares it with those people who have less. So there's a magnificent idea here in terms of who Joseph was. Joseph, the words used about Joseph here are Nazir Echav. And again, think about Hirsch's framework of unity here. Nazir Echav means literally the one who was cut off from his brothers. And Moshe at the end of the Torah also uses similar language about the tribe of Joseph. Now we know that that's factually true. He's the one who was sold out by his brothers at 17. He's the one, as it says here, who has arrows of speech targeted him when the wife of Potiphar had him thrown back in jail. He's the one who seems to always be doubted by his brothers and never trusted, even to the very end of the Torah reading here, to the end of the book of Genesis, where again, they come to him and say, we're ready to be your slaves. And he looks at them and says, I don't know what you're talking about. God gave me a role in the world. My role is to provide for the Jewish people. My role is to protect the Jewish people. Many of the things that are analogous to what it means to be a king. What we see here in terms of these brachot is the complement to Yehuda emerging as the Bechor, as the firstborn, and therefore the king. We see here that Joseph emerges as the one who has the deepest thirst and yearning for unity of the Jewish people. Why? Because he tasted so profoundly the bitterness of the lack of that unity. He's the one from the age of 17 until 37, didn't see his father, was sold out by his brothers, wondered, Ha'od avichai, is my father still alive? Am I still part of this family? Do I still matter to the Jewish people? Have they moved on without me? That's what he yearned for. But with that yearning, Joseph becomes the recipient of the greatest blessings because he takes that thirst for unity and he translates it to an unstinting, unlimited commitment to sharing what he has with others, to using his position in Egypt to protect and preserve the Jewish people, using his wealth to safeguard the dignity of his father so that the burial takes place back where his father wanted. Explaining, don't bury me in Egypt, but take me out of here because you're surely going to be redeemed, infusing the future of the Jewish people with hope. So what do we see here? Yes, there's the role of leader that has to be fulfilled, and it takes certain qualifications. And that's integral for there being harmony and unity and oneness. Okay, we're not hippies of the 1960s or the people who gathered in Wall Street, 20 years ago with the idea that we're going to have a perfect democracy where no one has any status over anyone else. That doesn't happen. That doesn't work. There needs to be recognition of leadership. There needs to be entrusting leadership in the hands of people who can act responsibly and who can take authority for the benefit of protecting and helping others. But there also needs profoundly to be within the Jewish people the yearning that we really become one, the acceptance of one another, the willingness to recognize the fact that yes, we're different. Yes, we don't see things the same way. Yes, it's not so simple to achieve harmony. It's not so simple to live in the same land. It's not so simple to function in the same society. But we have to find a way to do so. And the commitment to do so requires this insight from the book of Proverbs, Tov Ayin. Tov Ayin, just giving slack to others, just having regard for others, truly respecting others, have empathy for others. Bo Yivarach, that's what brings blessing into the world. And with that becomes the idea that from God's perspective, of course, I'm going to put blessings into the hands of a Joseph. Why? Because then it'll be distributed for the benefit of everyone. It won't be so that he can amass for himself special comfort or special privilege. It'll rather be done with an eye out on the part of the recipient of the blessing to see to it that everyone is blessed from it. And you can see how this is such a beautiful closure and fulfillment to the whole book of Bereshit, the whole book of the formation and formulation of the world. We're going to go on now to four more books of the Torah, which have to do with the Jewish people being molded and shaped through the horrific years of enslavement, being emancipated, seeing so clearly how it's Hashem's hand that guides the world, and then seeking to become God's ambassadors and learning how to do that harmoniously through the course of the rest of the Torah and through the course of the rest of human history. We see the Acharit Hayamim. We understand now, certainly after these thousands of additional years, how profound it was that Jacob's last breath was devoted to achieving a sense of harmony, oneness, and unity amongst the Jewish people, recognizing how difficult that was, recognizing the faults as well as the strengths of each one of his children, and seeing so clearly that that desire, that yearning to truly live as one family, as one people, in spite of our differences, that would hold the key to fulfilling the Jewish future and to ultimately achieving the end of days. That's the conclusion of this book. That's how Genesis does come to a meaningful, cogent conclusion. The world went through 2,000 years of tohu vavohu, of total chaos, of meaninglessness, of alienation from God. Along came Abraham and began a family that finding its way, living in relationship with Hashem, and finding our way forward, living in relationship with one another. Let's do that and we also will come to a strong, positive, and meaningful conclusion, not only for our own lives, but for the whole sake of humankind. And that's where we're headed. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. We should be strong.